Hi Year 10, here is our 8th, 7th, it's hard to keep count. I think this must be 8th lesson on in spectacles. It's a bit like I had to look up what day of the week it was earlier, which is a bit bizarre. So our 8th lesson on and in spectacles. Today we're going to analyse how Gerald is presented in Act 2 and summarise what he did to Eva Smith. So we're going to read today Gerald being interrogated by the inspector. We'll find out what he did to Eva Smith, and we will be analysing how this develops our impression of Gerald. So our old vocabulary is dutiful. So think back to dutiful. We looked at that a lot when we looked at Romeo and Juliet. So what dutiful behaviour would Priestley want to see from Mr. Burling as a result of his interview? So remember, Priestley and the inspector wants all of these characters on stage to change for the better, to understand their duty to the community and their duty to the less fortunate. So what sort of dutiful behaviour would Priestley want to see from men like Mr. Burling? How would he want them to change? So pause the video and have a go answering that question. So our new word is gallant. Now, if someone is gallant, then they're showing brave or heroic behaviour. So we're going to think about Romeo and Juliet. Do you think Juliet's decision to fake her death was gallant or foolish? Explain your answer. Now, I'm referring to Friar Lawrence giving her the potion or the mixture that he had made, the herbal mixture, to make everyone, including her parents and the nurse, think that she is dead. Do you think that was a gallant choice on Juliet's behalf, or do you think it was foolish? And again, explain your answer. Okay, so pause the video and answer those questions, please. So dutiful simply means doing your duty, accepting your responsibilities based on your role. So Priestley, as a socialist, believed that if you were a factory owner, if you were someone who was rich with a position of power and high status, you should use that status to benefit not just yourself, but benefit others as well. So the sort of dutiful behaviour he would want to see from industrialists, capitalists like Mr. Burling, is paying his workers a fair living wage, not just enough to survive on, but enough to thrive on. That he would make sure that they have decent working conditions, that he would treat his workers with respect, because without his workers, his factory would not make any money for himself. He would expect that, when, I know he's not Lord Mayor anymore, but if he was in a position like Lord Mayor, he would make decisions not just for the benefit of the wealthy, for the capitalists, that he would make decisions for the benefit of all, for the collective. It's really, really interesting studying this play and looking at what's going on, at the moment, what all governments around the world are having to come up with lots and lots of socialist type policies simply to get people financially, to get businesses financially through this incredibly insane situation. So it's quite interesting to look at where in a crisis governments have to turn to socialism, to socialist policies to see its people through. So Priestley, if he was alive today, would say, well, if you can do it in a crisis, why haven't you done it before? Why haven't you done, if you can get this sort of money, why haven't you used it already outside of a pandemic to deal with inequality, to deal with homelessness, to make wages fairer, etc., etc. So it's, interesting link that we can make between what's going on at the moment and in spectacles, which is the beauty of all of these literature texts. Of course, we can always link them to our own society, and they are timeless in that sense. Look, I bet you've missed me waffling on about society and politics, haven't you? So there we go. So gallant then, being brave or heroic. Now, there's no right or wrong answer here. You could argue that her decision was gallant because actually she loves Romeo so much, she doesn't want to betray him because of course she'd be forced to sleep with Paris as her duty as a wife. She doesn't want to commit the sin of bigamy by marrying more than one person. So actually you could argue it is very gallant, it is very brave and heroic of her that she is prepared to put herself under such risk. And remember that big monologue Juliet delivers before she takes the potion. The poor girl is absolutely terrified. But again, as we spoke about, you could argue that Romeo and Juliet's behaviour throughout the whole play is incredibly foolish. You could say that actually Friar Lawrence was incredibly irresponsible. She should have just been honest. You could argue honest with her parents. There was very little they could do to break up the marriage once they'd slept together. But we have to accept that it wouldn't be as interesting a play as if Romeo and Juliet sat their parents down and just sort of broke the news to them. So, we are going to continue reading the play. Okay, hope you guys should be able to see that now. Okay, so enter Burling, who closes the door behind him. So remember, Mr. Burling's been off stage. He went to speak to his wife and also to Eric. So Burling's rather hot and bothered. So, you know, we can see that Mr. Burling is being affected by all of this. He likes to sort of pretend he's not, but it is getting to him, this situation. I've been trying to persuade Eric to go to bed, but he won't. Now he says you told him to stay up. Did you? Now this is interesting because it's more evidence that the inspector has the power. Mr. Burling, his dad, has tried to get him to do something and Eric's refused because the inspector has told him not to. The inspector says, yes, I did. Burling says, why? The inspector, because I shall want to talk to him, Mr. Burling. Burling says, I can't see why you should, but if you must, then I suggest you do it now. Have him in and get it over and then let the lad go. The inspector says, no, I can't do that yet. I'm sorry, but he'll have to wait. So again, he refuses to give in to Mr. Burling. He's saying, no, I will interview him when I want to interview him. So again, more evidence that the inspector has the power. So Burling says, now, look here, Inspector. But the inspector cuts in with authority. He must wait his turn. Now, again, we need to remember that this is very unusual behaviour for a policeman. Sheila says to Mrs. Burling, you see, so this is in reference to Sheila, obviously showing that she's been affected by the inspector. Mrs. Burling says, no, I don't, and please be quiet, Sheila. So yet again, patronising her daughter. Burling says angrily, so he is obviously not liking the way he's being spoken to. Inspector, I've told you before, I don't like the tone nor the way that you're handling this inquiry. I don't propose to give you much rope. Now, this is sort of a metaphor, this idea of rope. It's an expression that you know, giving someone rope so they can hang themselves, basically meaning that you are putting them in, manipulating them into a situation where they're going to make things work for themselves. Okay, so, you know, Mr. Burling is not liking this sort of level of disrespect. The inspector says, you needn't give me any rope. And Sheila says, rather wildly with a laugh, no, he's giving us the rope, so we'll hang ourselves. Now, again, this is a metaphor. It's not literally talking hanging themselves. It's saying, you know, they're guilty enough already. You know, all the inspector is actually getting them to do is admit what they've already done. Okay, so Burling says to Mrs. Burling, what's the matter with that child? And Mrs. Burling says, overexcited, you know, as if she's eaten too many sweets or something, and she refuses to go. She says with sudden anger to the inspector, well, come along. So again, talks down to him. Mrs. Burling pretty much talks down to everyone, doesn't she, including her own husband earlier when she moaned at him about thanking the cook. She talks as if she's superior to everyone. The inspector says coolly. Now, the inspector always keeps calm. Okay, he never loses his cool. At the end of January last year, this girl, Eva Smith, had to leave Millwoods because Miss Burling compelled them to discharge her. And then she stopped being Eva Smith looking for a jog and became Daisy Renton with other ideas. Sharply turning on him, Mr. Croft, when did you first get to know her? So, you know, there is nothing that the inspector doesn't already know. An exclamation of surprise from Burling and Mrs. Burling. Gerald says, where did you get the idea that I did know her? So again, he's being evasive. Remember that word from earlier, trying to hide the truth, like Eric was being? Sheila says, it's no use, Gerald, you're wasting time. The inspector said, as soon as I mentioned the name Daisy Renton, it was obvious you'd known her. You gave yourself away at once. He pretty much did, didn't he? And Sheila says bitterly, of course he did. And the inspector says, and anyhow, I knew already. So, you know, the inspector, he seems to have all of this information. He's getting them to answer questions for him, but not to tell him anything that he doesn't already know. It's about them admitting it to themselves and each other. When and where did you first meet her? All right, if you must have it. I met her first sometime in March last year. So you can write in your books or add to your timeline, March 1911, Gerald meets Eva Smith or Daisy Renton. Okay, so we've got September, she was fired. September 1910, fired from Mr. Burling's factory. December 1910, gets a job in Millwoods. January 1911, gets fired from Millwoods. And then March 1911, meets Gerald. Okay, so this is our timeline of Eva Smith's life. In the Stalls Bar at the Palace. I mean the Palace Music Hall here in Brumley. Now, a music hall would be a cross between a theatre and a bar. So it would be somewhere aimed at men, where you could go and sort of watch a show. You know, I've had students before could turn around to me and go, do you mean a strip club, miss? And I'm like, no, not a strip club. But maybe like a high-end, early 20th century, upper middle class gentleman's version of one, sort of. You know, at the end of the day, it is a hangout for prostitutes. It is a place where men go basically to unwind. Sheila says, well, we didn't think you meant Buckingham Palace. So she's being very sarcastic here. So again, we're seeing a different side of Sheila. She's being much more sort of assertive to the men. Gerald says to Sheila, thanks, you're going to be a great help, I can see. You've said your piece and you're obviously going to hate this. So why on earth don't you leave us to it? So he doesn't understand why Gerald wants to stick around. And Sheila says, nothing would induce me. I want to understand exactly what happens when a man says he's so busy at the works that he can hardly ever find time to come and see the girl he's supposed to be in love with. I wouldn't miss it for the world. So, you know, Sheila feels, and rightly so, really betrayed. Okay, really betrayed by Gerald. The inspector says with authority, yes, Mr. Croft, in the Stalls Bar at the Palace Variety Theatre, so he's trying to get the interview back on track. Gerald says, I happened to look in one night after a long, dull day, and as the show wasn't very bright, I went down to the bar for a drink. It's a favourite haunt of women of the town. So basically, prostitutes. Now, we know that if you were poor and you were a woman, sometimes prostitution was one of your only options of actually earning money and not starving to death. Sorry, I've actually just highlighted the wrong thing. Women of the town. Mrs. Burling says, women of the town? Burling says, yes, but I see no point in mentioning the subject, especially. So, you know, they're still trying to, you know, treat Sheila like a child. You know, this is a grown adult woman. Oh, we don't want to mention prostitutes in front of her, as if she's not a grown adult woman about to get married. Mrs. Burling says, it would be much better if Sheila didn't listen to this story at all. And Sheila says, but you're forgetting I'm supposed to be engaged to the hero of it. Go on, Gerald, you went down into the bar, which is a favourite haunt of women of the town. Gerald says, I'm glad I amuse you. The inspector says sharply, come along, Mr. Croft, what happened? What happened? Gerald says, I didn't propose to stay long down there. I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. Okay, so again, he's referring to the prostitutes or type of prostitute. But then I noticed a girl who looked quite different. She was very pretty. Oh, look, yet again referring to her as pretty. Soft brown hair and big dark eyes. He breaks off. My God. The inspector says, what's the matter? Now, Gerald is distressed. Sorry. Well, I've suddenly realised, taking it in properly, that she's dead. So, you know, Gerald is emotionally affected by her death. The inspector says harshly, yes, she's dead. And Sheila says, and probably between us, we killed her. So yet again, Sheila accepts this idea of responsibility. Mrs. Berling says sharply, Sheila, don't talk nonsense. So again, this idea of responsibility is obviously not something Mrs. Berling is particularly on board with. Sheila says, you wait, mother. The inspector says to Gerald, go on. She looked young and fresh and charming and altogether out of place down here. So she didn't fit in, you know, she wasn't the normal sort. And obviously she wasn't enjoying herself. Old Joe Meggerty, half drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. So there was a man that was obviously trying to come on to Eva or Daisy. Mrs. Berling says, there's no need to be disgusting, and surely you don't mean Alderman Meggerty. So this again is someone of a high status. Okay, so this is someone of a high status and a position of power. Okay, someone involved in the legal system. Gerald says, of course I do. He's a notorious womanizer, as well as being one of the worst sots and rogues in Brumley. So basically he'll go around and try and assault women, basically. And the inspector says, quite right. Mrs. Berling is staggered by this news. She's shocked. Okay, she's completely shocked, which is really interesting because if it's obviously a well-known fact, why would she not know that already? Well, really, Alderman Meggerty, I must say, we are learning something. Now, this presents Mrs. Berling, yet again, as incredibly ignorant. Mrs. Berling thinks, if you're rich, you must be a good person. So, you know, someone like Alderman Meggerty, there's no way he could be a bad person because he's rich. But she says we're learning something. She's not learning the right lesson. The lesson we're supposed to be learning is about socialism and those principles. And of course, this doesn't seem something she's very receptive to. She just says coolly, of course we are, but everybody knows about that horrible old Meggerty. So even Sheila knows. This supposedly, you know, sheltered Sheila that knows nothing. So she is less ignorant than her mother. A girl I know had to see him at the town hall one afternoon and she only escaped with a torn blouse. Berling is shocked. Sheila! The inspector says, Gerald, go on, please. Gerald said, the girl saw me looking at her and gave me a glance that was nothing less than a cry for help. So I went across and told Joe Meggerty some nonsense. that the manager had a message for him or something like that, got him out of the way, and then told the girl that if she didn't want any more of that sort of thing, she'd better let me take her out of there. And she agreed at once. So Gerald basically rescued her. Okay, he rescued her. He got her away from this horrible old man and was her knight in shining armour. The inspector says, "Where did you go?" Gerald says, "We went along to the county hotel, which I knew would be quiet at that time of night, and we had a drink or two and talked." Now, why did he want it to be quiet? Did he want it to be quiet because he didn't want to be seen with her? Because whilst, you know, men would have associated with prostitutes, obviously, they sort of didn't go around being massively public about it. But even if people didn't assume Eva was with him as a prostitute, she was of a lower class, and, you know, he's an aristocrat. Or was he getting her somewhere quiet for her own sake? Because she was obviously shaken up. Like everything with Gerald's motivations here, there's two sides to it. The inspector says, "Did she drink much at the time?" And Gerald said no, she only had a port and lemonade or some such concoction. All she wanted was to talk. A little friendliness. And I gather that Joe Megatee's advances had left her rather shaken, as well they might. So she just wanted someone to be nice to her, to show her some kindness. Which is really sad, really. Because this isn't a person, you know, think about the way that she's been treated. This isn't someone who has had a lot of kindness shown to her, and that's all she wanted. And to be fair to Gerald, he gave her that. He showed her that kindness. The inspector says, "She talked about herself?" Gerald says, "Yes, I asked her questions about herself. She told me her name was Daisy Renton, that she'd lost both parents and that she came originally from somewhere outside Bromley. She also told me she'd had a job in one of the works here and had had to leave after a strike. She said something about the shop too, but wouldn't say which it was, and she was deliberately vague about what happened. I couldn't get any exact details from her about herself, just because I couldn't get any exact details from her about herself, just because she felt I was interested and friendly. But at the same time, she wanted to be Daisy Renton, and not Eva Smith. In fact, I heard that name for the first time tonight. What she did let slip, though she didn't mean to, was that she was desperately hard up, and at that moment was actually hungry. I made the people at the county find some food for her." So, you know, he tries to help her and take care of her. The inspector says, "And then you decided to keep her as your mistress." Now, it's really important to define what we mean by mistress, okay? So, as we know, in 1912, men were seen as the more dominant sex. Men were the ones, it was a patriarchal society, and men were largely the ones that were in control and had power. Now, men would have wives, sometimes women they did genuinely care about and love, sometimes women that they sort of had to marry for whatever reason, and it was, whilst not accepted, very common that these men would also have mistresses. Now, a mistress is a bit like a girlfriend, really. So you've got your wife, but you've also got a girlfriend as well, and this is someone who you would pay, but pay in the sense that you would probably pay their rent in somewhere that they lived. You would probably give them, you know, an allowance, sort of money to live by, but there would be typically sort of an emotional connection, if you like. A mistress is very different to picking a woman up as a prostitute at the, you know, music hall or at a brothel or whatever. That is typically, you know, just money for sex, basically, and just that exchange, you know, free of emotion. And again, you may see the same prostitute twice, you may not. It's a different level to a mistress, okay? And this is obviously what Eva or Daisy became to Gerald. She became his mistress. During that time, he didn't come near Sheila. So Mrs. Burling says, what? Sheila says, of course, Mother. It was obvious from the start. Go on, Gerald. Don't mind Mother. Gerald said, I discovered not that night, but 2 nights later, when we met again, not accidentally this time, of course, that in fact she hadn't a penny and was going to be turned out of the miserable back bedroom she had. Okay, so this is really important. So she had no money and was about to be chucked out of the horrible little room that she lived in. It happened that a friend of mine, Charlie Bunswick, had gone off to Canada for 6 months and had let me have the key of a nice little set of rooms he had in Morgan Terrace, and had asked me to keep an eye on them for him and use them if I wanted to. So again, what does he mean by use them if he wanted to? This is Gerald, an aristocrat. He's got plenty of properties for himself. So it depends on how much credit you want to give Gerald, really. Was it just somewhere to stay? Just, you know, like a hotel? Was it somewhere, if he did pick up a woman or a prostitute to take her back to? Again, Gerald's intentions are very ambiguous here, you know, deliberately. Remember, ambiguous is we don't really know what the right inference is. You know, we're left to make up our own minds. So I insisted on Daisy moving into those rooms, and I made her take some money to keep her going there. So he said, right, you can live here and I'll give you some money, some charity. You know, he's being kind. He says carefully to the inspector, I want you to understand that I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her. I made her go to Morgan Terrace because I was sorry for her. I didn't like the idea of her going back to the Palace Bar. I didn't ask for anything in return. So Gerald claims he did it out of pity and kindness, not because he fancied her and wanted to manipulate her into sleeping with him. Again, you can decide what you believe at the end of the day. The inspector says, I see. And Sheila says, yes, but why are you saying that to him? You ought to be saying it to me. So Sheila's like, well, yeah, I'm the one you should be apologising to while you were, you know, sleeping with this girl behind my back. Gerald says, I suppose I ought really. I'm sorry, Sheila. Sheila cuts in as he hesitates. I know. Somehow he makes you. So they're talking about the inspector here. And again, it's another reference to this idea that the inspector is powerful. And the inspector says, yes, but she became your mistress. And Gerald says, yes, I suppose it was inevitable. She was young and pretty and warm-hearted and intensely grateful. I became at once the most important person in her life. You understand? And the inspector says, yes, she was a woman. She was lonely. Were you in love with her? And Sheila says, just what I was going to ask. And Burling says angrily, I really must protest. Now, think about your Mr. Burling. He must be panicking. He has a lot riding on this engagement. And here is, you know, Gerald admitting to an affair. So he's obviously not very happy. The inspector turns on him sharply. Why should you do any protesting? It was you who turned the girl out in the first place. So he's like, well, this is all your fault anyway. So Burling's rather taken aback. Well, I only did what any employer might have done. Still won't accept responsibility. And what I was, in which my daughter, a young unmarried girl, is being dragged into this. The inspector says sharply, your daughter isn't living on the moon, she's here in Brumley too. So he's saying, you know, you've got no excuse for keeping your daughter ignorant. She says, yes, and it was I who had the girl turned out of her job in Millwoods, and I'm supposed to be engaged to Gerald, and I'm not a child, don't forget. I've a right to know. So we can see Sheila's standing up for herself. Now, the wonderful thing about Sheila is that she is growing up before our eyes, really. You know, she's standing up for herself. She's being more assertive. Gerald hesitates. So they say, were you in love with her, Gerald? And he hesitates. It's hard to say. I didn't feel about her as she felt about me. So she had stronger feelings. You know, she would have been in love with him. He didn't necessarily love her, but he did like her. He did care about her. Sheila says with sharp sarcasm, of course not. You were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it, Gerald. So again, she's like, you must have loved it. You must have loved feeling like such a big, important man, you know, like some gallant, brave knight in shining armour, swooping in and rescuing this girl, making her dependent on you, you know, seeing the hero worship in her eyes when she looked at you. You must have really liked that. And Gerald says, all right, I did for a time. Nearly any man would have done. And Sheila says, that's probably about the best thing you've said tonight. At least it's honest. Did you go and see her every night? Gerald says, no, I wasn't telling you a complete lie when I said I'd been very busy at the works all that time. We were very busy, but of course I did see a good deal of her. Mrs. Burling says, oh, I don't think we want any further details of this disgusting affair. Sheila cuts in, I do, and anyhow, we haven't had any details yet. And Gerald says, and you're not going to have any. He says to Mrs. Burling, you know, it wasn't disgusting. So it's interesting that he's not ashamed of the relationship, which sort of does make you think a little bit better of him in a way. He's not ashamed of the fact that he had this relationship with this working class girl. He obviously feels bad that he's betrayed Sheila, but he's not ashamed of Daisy. But Mrs. Burling says, it's disgusting to me. And Sheila says, yes, but after all, you didn't come into this, did you, Mother? She's like, well, it's got nothing to do with you. Gerald says, is there anything else you want to know, that you ought to know? The inspector says, yes. When did this affair end? And Gerald says, I can tell you exactly. The first week of September. So again, add to your timeline. September 1911, Gerald breaks up with Eva Smith. So they were together for about 6 months. I had to go away for several weeks then on business, and by that time, Daisy knew it was coming to an end. So I broke it off definitely before I went. The inspector says, how did she take it? Gerald says, better than I hoped. She was very gallant about it. So here's our word from the start of the lesson. You know, she was brave and accepting. Sheila says with irony, that was nice for you. Gerald says, no, it wasn't. He waits a moment, and then in a low, troubled tone, she told me she'd been happier than she'd ever been before, but that she knew it couldn't last, hadn't expected it to last. She didn't blame me at all. I wish to God she had now. Perhaps I'd feel better about it. Now this is interesting because he did feel guilty. She knew it couldn't last because of the class difference. You know, Daisy or Eva wasn't an idiot. She knew that even if Gerald did care about her, it wouldn't have been enough to overcome those class barriers. She'd been happier than she'd ever been before. Now, this is really important here because you've got to remember this is a girl who later, you know, kills herself. And if you felt that you'd, you know, been happier than you'd ever been before and you weren't going to ever be as happy again or have anything as wonderful as that relationship and that lifestyle for the last 6 months, then you could argue that that is reason to eventually, after life knocks you down a few more times, to take your own life. The inspector said she had to move out of those rooms. Gerald says, yes, we'd agreed about that. She'd saved a little money during the summer. She'd lived very economically on what I'd allowed her. Just always that bit, just language grates on me. Again, the power imbalance. You know, anything she had, it's only because Gerald allowed her and didn't want to take more from me. But I insisted on a parting gift of enough money, though it wasn't so very much, to see her through to the end of the year. Now, the thing you need to remember with Gerald is that in many ways Gerald comes out of this much better than Sheila and Mr. Burling. However, this is a man who is incredibly wealthy. This is a man whose father owns a massively successful factory. Yes, he gives Eva and Daisy a bit of money to see her through to the next few months. But what about after that? Does he check in on her in a few months' time to check that she's all right? Does he try to get her a job? Does he offer her a job at one of his factories? Does he try to find her a secure place to live before waltzing off into the sunset back to his nice little life and Sheila at home? He doesn't do any of that. He literally says, oh well, here's some money. I'm sort of washing my hands of responsibility for you after being with you and sleeping with you for the last 6 months, and I'm walking away. See ya. So on one level, yes, Gerald treated her nicely, he rescued her, he was like this gallant fairy prince out of a fairy tale. But he arguably gave her a really lovely experience, then took it away from her, and then never saw her again, not even bothering to check that she would be okay without him. And giving someone a little bit of money when you have an untold amount of money, to me, personally, isn't exactly that nice, because at the end of the day, putting your hand in your pocket is easy when you have lots of money. Why not check that she's okay? Why not make sure that you're leaving her in a secure situation before you go off? So again, you may view Gerald more sympathetically than I do. And remember, the beauty of literature is that we will all interpret these in different ways. But there is always something, whenever I teach this play, that there's something about Gerald's treatment of Eva Smith that really doesn't sit right with me at all. The inspector says, did she tell you what she proposed to do after you'd left her? And Gerald said, no, she refused to talk about that. So okay, fair enough, she didn't want to tell him what she was going to do. But why did he still not help her further? I got the idea once or twice from what she said that she thought of leaving Brumley. Whether she did or not, I don't know. Did she? The inspector says yes. She went away for about 2 months to some seaside place. Gerald says by herself. The inspector says yes. I think she went away to be alone, to be quiet, to remember all that had happened between you. So that's so sad. Gerald says, how do you know that? But says she kept a rough sort of diary, and she said there that she had to go away and be quiet and remember, just to make it last longer. She felt there'd never be anything as good again for her, so she had to make it last longer. So she knew that she would never be that happy again. You know, nothing would ever compare. She had to make it last longer, so she just wanted to, almost as if she could pretend that they were still together. It's desperately sad. And you could argue that actually, should Gerald have put her in that position in the first place? Should he have given her that wonderful experience and then take it away? Or was that just cruel? Was it just cruel? And actually his motivations in saving her was about making him feel like the big important man, like Sheila said, like some fairy prince. Because actually he's leaving her in no better a position than he found her in. And what she has then, again, this is a girl who 4 months later decides to kill herself, feeling like she'd never have something that amazing in her life again. And Gerald says gravely, seriously, I see. Well, I never saw her again, and that's all I can tell you. And the inspector says, it's all I want to know from you. Gerald says, in that case, as I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear to be, and well, I'd like to be alone for a while. I'd be glad if you'd let me go. So he is upset. You know, he is emotional about the fact that this girl is dead. He does probably feel guilt, although it's interesting that that feeling of guilt by Gerald is left to be very ambiguous. Sheila openly and very explicitly accepts responsibility. We can just infer through Gerald's sadness that he feels guilt, but he could just be grieving the fact that she's dead. He may not feel that he played any part in it. The inspector says, go where? Home? Gerald says, no, I'll just go out, walk about for a while if you don't mind. I'll come back. The inspector says, all right, Mr. Croft. And Sheila says, but just in case you forget or decide not to come back, Gerald, I think you better take this with you. She hands him the ring. So you can't help but sort of applaud Sheila here. You know, she's not letting him he's literally had an affair for 6 months. She's not letting him get away with it. Some women, lesser women, would probably look at the fancy engagement ring, look at the aristocratic husband and go, oh, well, do you know what, never mind. It's just men being men. It's what men do. Let's just forget about it. But not Sheila. Sheila's got too much self-respect and self-worth. And again, she's got these sort of emerging socialist ideals here. And she's like, no, take your ring back. Gerald says, I see, well, I was expecting this. And Sheila says, I don't dislike you as I did half an hour ago, Gerald. In fact, in some odd way, I rather respect you more than I've ever done before. So this is Sheila having a very mature attitude. She's not angry. In fact, she respects him. I knew anyhow you were lying about those months last year when you hardly came near me, and I knew there was something fishy about that time. And now at least you've been honest. And I believe what you told us about the way you helped her at first. Now that's interesting. Sheila believes him, just out of pity. And it was my fault, really, that she was so desperate when you first met her. But this has made a difference. You and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner here. We'd have to start all over again. Oh, it's a bit of a dodgy line. Getting to know each other. So she's not breaking up with him for good. She's saying they've got to start again. They're different people now. So, you know, Sheila certainly has changed. Berling says, now Sheila, I'm not defending him, apart from the fact that he is, but you must understand that a lot of young men, so remember, Berling is literally watching his hopes and dreams crumble in front of his eyes. He's trying to make up, trying to justify. Okay, hang on out, Mummy's almost done. Don't interfere, please, Father. Gerald knows what I mean, and you apparently don't. Gerald says, yes, I know what you mean, but I'm coming back if I may. Okay, that's a little boy hand. I thought they'd kept me reasonably quiet for 43 minutes. Right. Don't interfere, please, Father. Gerald knows what I mean and you apparently don't. Do you want to say hello to my students sitting at home?
No.
No, fair enough. Okay, that's the wrong page. Gerald says, yes, I know what you mean, but I'm coming back, if I may. Sheila says, all right. And Berling says, well, really, I don't know. I think we've had just about come to the end of this wretched business. Gerald says, I don't think so, excuse me. And they watch him go out in silence, and we hear the front door slam. So, well done, that was quite a long bit that we annotated today. So, the two things I'd like you to do, you waving, I would like you to summarise what Gerald did to Eva Smith. I would like you to pick one short quotation and analyse how Gerald is presented during the inspector's interview. And then finally, of the three characters, Mr. Berling, Sheila and Gerald, who do you blame for Eva Smith's suicide, and explain your answer. Okay, so write me a summary Write me 1 mini PE on how Gerald is presented, and then write me an explanation in your opinion, your personal opinion, no right or wrong answer, of the 3 characters, Mr. Burling, Sheila and Gerald, that we've read so far. Who do you think is the most responsible for Eva Smith's suicide so far? Okay? So send me please your answers to these 3 things. And it is goodbye for now. You're going to say goodbye, Oak?
Goodbye.
You going to say goodbye? There we go, still in his pyjamas. Okay, as always, any problems, pop me an email. Bye.